I arrived home exhausted after a long day at work, my body aching for rest and my mind longing for the comfort of my living room couch. The summer heat had been relentless, and all I wanted was to kick off my shoes, pour a cold drink, and lose myself in mindless television for a few hours. But the moment I stepped onto the porch, my heart stopped. An eviction notice was taped to the door, its official letterhead stark against the blue paint. My hands trembled as I tore it off, scanning the words in disbelief. 30 days to vacate. The letters blurred as I read them again and again, hoping they might somehow rearrange themselves into something less devastating. This had to be a mistake. We had never missed a payment. The mortgage was on auto draft from our joint account. I rushed inside, calling for Mark, my voice echoing through our home of 6 years. The house was empty, unusually tidy, as if someone had cleaned up, knowing they wouldn't return. My panic grew as I dropped my bag and ran to our home office, digging through the filing cabinet where we kept important documents. Tax returns, insurance policies, and finally, the folder marked House. That's when I found it. A sales agreement dated 3 weeks ago. My name wasn't on it, but Mark's signature was unmistakable at the bottom of the page. Next to it, the signature of someone I'd never heard of. He had sold our house, without telling me, without my consent. I sank into the office chair, the document shaking in my hands. Our wedding photos stared down at me from the wall, Mark's smiling face now a cruel joke. The home we had chosen together, the place where we had planned to start, a family someday, had been sold from under me, and Mark was nowhere to be found. I called Mark over and over, each unanswered ring fueling my rage. His voicemail picked up 6 times before I stopped trying. My mind raced with possibilities. Was he hurt? Had someone forced him to sign? But deep down, I knew. This was deliberate. I paced our kitchen, clenching and unclenching my fists before grabbing my laptop. I logged into our shared accounts, something we'd kept even after 7 years together, a symbol of trust I now regretted. His email gave me nothing, but his location history showed a recent check-in at the Grandview, a luxury hotel downtown that we'd always joked was for people with more money than sense. Without thinking twice, I grabbed my keys and drove there, rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd demand answers. The lobby gleamed with marble and crystal, making me conscious of my work clothes and messy hair. I didn't care. I marched to the reception desk and demanded to see him. "Tell Mark Wilson his wife is here," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. 20. Minutes later he appeared, dressed in clothes I'd never seen before, an expensive watch glinting on his wrist. He looked tanned, rested, and worst of all, calm. Too calm for someone whose wife had just discovered his betrayal. "You weren't supposed to find out this soon," he muttered, guiding me to a quiet corner of the lobby. My blood boiled. "You sold our home behind my back," I shouted, not caring who heard. "Were you planning to tell me before the new owners kicked me out?" He sighed, looking annoyed rather than guilty. "It was my house too. I needed the money." "For what?" I demanded, gesturing at his new clothes. "To play rich guy at a hotel while I lose everything?" He shrugged, and in that moment, I saw no regret in his eyes. Just arrogance, as if I were overreacting to a minor inconvenience rather than a life-shattering betrayal. If he thought I'd let this go, cry a little and then fade away, he was wrong. Dangerously wrong. The next morning, I sat across from a lawyer in a modest office downtown, my hands gripping the edge of my chair so tightly my knuckles turned white. I'd barely slept, spending the night researching property law and calling every attorney who mentioned real estate fraud on their website. Janice Kim had agreed to see me first thing. "So he just sold it?" she asked, frowning at the documents I'd brought. The eviction notice, a copy of our deed showing joint ownership, and the sales agreement I'd found. "Yes, I didn't sign anything. Didn't know anything until I found the eviction notice yesterday." She flipped through the papers slowly, occasionally making notes. The clock on her wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching my nerves further. Finally, she looked up, her expression firm, but somehow reassuring. "This is illegal," she said simply. "Since you co-owned the house, he had no right to sell it without your consent. This sales agreement shows either forgery or misrepresentation to the buyers." A wave of relief mixed with fury washed over me. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. What Mark had done wasn't just cruel, it was criminal. "Can we stop this?" I asked, leaning forward. "The eviction says I have 30 days, but..." "If we move fast, yes." She nodded, already reaching for her phone. "We can file an injunction to block the sale and freeze his accounts before he spends the money. We'll also need to contact the buyers, who are potentially victims here too." She began outlining a strategy: emergency, filings, potential criminal charges, forensic accounting to trace the money. Each step she described made the situation more real, but also gave me something I desperately needed: hope. Mark thought he had outsmarted me, that I would collapse under the weight of his betrayal. He was about to regret underestimating me. "Do whatever it takes," I told her, signing the retainer agreement without hesitation. "I want my house back, and I want him to pay for what he's done." Janice smiled for the first time since I'd entered her office. "Then let's get started. I have a judge who owes me a favor, and we need to move before your husband spends another penny of your money." I needed to know where Mark had stashed the money before it disappeared completely. Our house had sold for well above market value, fact that both infuriated me and provided a strange sense of validation. At least he hadn't sold our memories cheaply. My lawyer hired a financial investigator who demanded emergency access to our joint accounts. The bank complied quickly once presented with the court order, and within hours, we had a complete record of Mark's recent transactions. What we found left me breathless. A shocking pattern emerged. He had already wired a large chunk of the money to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, $300,000, gone with a single transfer. The account was in his name only, opened just 2 weeks before he sold the house. "He's been planning this for a while," Janice said, her tone grim as we reviewed the statements in her office. "This wasn't a sudden decision." "The rest of the money?" "He was spending it recklessly. 5-star restaurants, rented luxury cars, spa treatments, designer clothes, a $50,000 watch. First-class plane tickets to destinations he'd never mentioned wanting to visit. He wasn't just hiding. He was celebrating his newfound wealth and freedom from our marriage." "Can we get it back?" I asked, staring at the printed bank statements spread across Janice's desk. "The offshore transfer will be challenging but not impossible. The local spending we can definitely recover." She picked up her phone. "I'm filing an emergency motion to freeze his remaining accounts right now. We still have a chance to stop him from burning through everything." As she made the call, I scrolled through the itemized list of Mark's expenditures. Each entry felt like a fresh betrayal. Dinner for 2 at places we could never afford when we were together. Hotel charges that included spa packages for couples. He wasn't just spending our money, he was already replacing me. I clenched my fists under the table. If he wanted to live like a king, I'd make sure he ended up with nothing. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about justice. 2 days later, I sat in a courtroom, my heart pounding as I stared across the aisle at Mark. He wore a tailored suit I'd never seen before and had gotten a fresh haircut. He smirked at me like he thought he could charm the judge the same way he'd charmed me all these years. Like he thought he could talk his way out of this the way he'd talked his way out of forgotten anniversaries and unexplained late nights. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, intimate enough that I could see the faint lines around his eyes when he frowned as my lawyer approached the bench. Janice moved with confidence, her voice clear and unwavering as she presented our case. "Your Honor, we have evidence of a fraudulent real estate transaction," she began, handing copies of documents to the clerk. "Mr. Wilson sold jointly owned property without his wife's knowledge or consent, forging her signature on several documents. Mark's attorney, a slick man in an even more expensive suit, tried to argue that I had verbally agreed to the sale. The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, seemed unimpressed. As my lawyer presented the evidence, proof of the fraudulent sale, financial records showing the offshore transfers, records of his lavish spending, Mark's confidence visibly wavered. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, tugging at his collar, no longer meeting my eyes across the room. Then came another blow I hadn't expected. The new buyers of our house, a young couple named Alvarez, had been called as witnesses. They testified that Mark had presented himself as a widower, claiming he was selling the house because it held too many painful memories. They were furious at being deceived, at being made unwitting participants in his scheme. "We would never have bought the house if we'd known," Mrs. Alvarez said, her voice trembling with anger. "We have a paper trail of Mr. Wilson actively hiding the fact that his wife was still alive and had rights to the property." The judge listened intently, her expression darkening as the evidence mounted. When she finally spoke, her ruling was swift and decisive. "The sale is nullified," she announced. "Mr. Wilson is ordered to return every cent to the buyers, and the property reverts to its original ownership status." She fixed Mark with a stern glare. "Additionally, since Mr. Wilson has profited from a shared asset, Mrs. Wilson has the right to pursue his remaining assets for damages." Mark's face drained of color. This was just the beginning. With the court ruling in my favor, Janice moved quickly to freeze Mark's remaining accounts. She filed paperwork with banks across the city, flagging his name in the financial system. His credit cards, savings accounts, investment portfolios, all of it locked down within hours. "What about the offshore transfer?" I asked Janice as we left the courthouse, the weight on my shoulders slightly lighter after the judge's decision. "Already in process," she said, sliding into her car beside me. "I've contacted financial authorities in the Cayman Islands. Since the transfer was made with funds from a fraudulent sale, they're flagging it as potential money laundering. Even offshore banks don't want that kind of trouble." The next 48 hours passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls. I stayed at a friend's apartment, unable to face our house, knowing that the young couple had started moving in, then been told they had to leave. The whole situation was a mess of Mark's making, with innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. By the third day, we received confirmation. His offshore transfer had indeed been flagged for fraud investigation. Those funds were now frozen too, pending the outcome of our case. He had nowhere to hide, no secret stash to draw from. When he tried to access his accounts that evening, he found himself locked out of everything. I know this because he called me, his voice tight with panic and rage. "You had no right," he spat into the phone. "That's my money." I laughed bitterly, surprising myself with how cold I sounded. "No, right? You sold our home behind my back. You forged my signature. You lied to innocent people." I paused, letting my words sink in. "And it wasn't your money, Mark. It was ours." For the first time, real panic seeped into his voice. "Sarah, I have nothing left. They froze everything, even my personal accounts from before we were married." I felt nothing but satisfaction as I replied, "Welcome to my world, Mark. How does it feel to have everything taken from you without warning?" I hung up before he could answer. For the first time since finding that eviction notice, I smiled. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the tables had finally turned. With his accounts frozen, Mark's lavish lifestyle crumbled faster than I expected. Through mutual friends and social media, I heard pieces of his downfall like dispatches from a war I was winning without firing a shot. First came the hotel. The Grandview had a strict policy. Any unpaid balance over 3 days resulted in immediate eviction. Mark's card was declined when they tried to run his weekly charge, and according to Jess, my friend who worked at the front desk, he caused quite a scene. He kept giving them different cards, and they all got declined, she told me over coffee. He was shouting about how there must be a mistake, that he's good for the money. Security had to escort him out. His rented car, a sleek black Mercedes convertible, was repossessed from the hotel parking lot the very next day. The luxury watch he'd flaunted at our courtroom appearance mysteriously disappeared from his wrist in photos posted days later. I wondered if he'd pawned it, or if it had been seized as well. The friends who had enjoyed his sudden wealth, the ones who'd accepted expensive dinners and nights out, stopped answering his calls. I knew this from his increasingly desperate social media posts, asking for places to stay, for loans that he promised to repay once this misunderstanding is cleared up. Desperate, he tried to withdraw cash from ATMs across town, but there was nothing left. No emergency funds, no hidden accounts my lawyer hadn't found. He had gambled everything on the belief that I wouldn't fight back, that I would accept his betrayal quietly. He had been catastrophically wrong. Within 2 weeks of the court ruling, Mark had no home, no money, nowhere to go. The man who had walked out on our marriage thinking he had secured a wealthy new life for himself was now essentially homeless. His carefully crafted plans had collapsed like a house of cards. I watched from a distance as reality hit him, refusing his calls, deleting his texts unread. Janice advised me to maintain this distance, to let the legal process work, without emotional complications. It wasn't easy. Part of me wanted to confront him, to see the look on his face now that he understood the consequences of his actions. But I restrained myself. This was a marathon, not a sprint, and I was in it for the long haul. He's running out of options, Janice told me during our weekly update, and we're just getting started. With Mark financially ruined, I took the final step I'd been considering since that first night. I filed for divorce. The papers were straightforward, citing fraud and abandonment as grounds. Janice had made sure every detail was covered, every financial disclosure complete. Since he attempted to hide assets and committed fraud during the marriage, you're entitled to a significant share of what little he has left, she explained as I signed the documents in her office. The courts don't look kindly on spouses who try to cheat their partners, especially through illegal means. I stared at my signature, feeling a strange mix of sadness and resolution. This wasn't how I had imagined my marriage would end. Not with lawyers and court filings and financial investigations. There had been love once, or at least I thought there had been. Now I wondered if Mark had ever seen me as anything more than a convenience, a stepping stone to something better. "How long will this take?" I asked, pushing the signed papers across the desk. Given the circumstances and the existing court rulings against him, we could be looking at a final decree in 3 to 4 months, much faster than a typical contested divorce. The process server delivered the papers to Mark at his brother's apartment, where he'd been staying. I wasn't present, but I imagined the look on his face when he realized this was happening. That I wasn't just fighting for the house, but ending our marriage entirely. He called me an hour later, his voice softer than it had been in weeks. Gone was the arrogance, the anger. Now he sounded desperate, maybe even afraid. "Sarah, please. We need to talk about this. You can't just throw away 8 years." I didn't throw anything away, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "You did that when you sold our home behind my back." "I made a mistake," he pleaded. "We can work this out. I'll make it up to you." I laughed, not out of humor but disbelief. "Make it up to me? With what, Mark? You have nothing left, and neither do I, thanks to you." "I still love you," he tried, a last-ditch effort that felt as hollow as everything else he'd ever told me. "No, you don't," I said quietly. "You love yourself. You always have. I was just too blind to see it." I hung up, blocking his number immediately after. There was no saving our marriage. He had destroyed it the moment he chose greed over loyalty, the moment he decided that I was disposable. Now he was learning that his actions had consequences, and I was no longer the one paying the price. At our final hearing 3 months later, the courtroom felt different. No longer intimidating, no longer foreign territory. I sat beside Janice feeling confident, prepared for whatever might happen. Mark looked nothing like the polished, arrogant man who had smirked at me during our first appearance. His borrowed suit hung loosely on his frame. He'd lost weight. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. His brother sat behind him instead of the expensive attorney he could no longer afford. The judge, the same stern woman who had nullified the house, Sale reviewed the file carefully before addressing the court. She asked questions about asset division, about the money that had been recovered, about Mark's attempts to hide funds. Each answer from my lawyer drove another nail into the coffin of his case. When it was Mark's turn to speak, he tried to paint himself as remorseful, as a man who had made one terrible mistake. But his words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. "Mrs. Wilson," the judge said, turning to me, "do you have anything you wish to add before I make my ruling?" I stood, my voice clear. "Your Honor, I didn't ask for any of this. I came home one day to find that my husband had sold our house without my knowledge. Everything that's happened since has been me trying to protect myself from his actions." I paused, looking directly at Mark for the first time that day. "I just want what's fair." The judge nodded and delivered her ruling without hesitation. Mark was forced to surrender his remaining assets to cover legal fees and restitution. The divorce was granted on grounds of fraudulent behavior and breach of fiduciary duty. I was awarded 70% of our marital assets, including the house that had been returned to us after the sale was voided. Additionally, Mark would be responsible for paying back the buyer's legal fees and moving expenses. He fought it, of course, argued that the division was unfair, that he would be left with nothing. The judge was unmoved. "Mr. Wilson, you attempted to defraud not only your wife but also innocent third parties," she said firmly. "The court finds that your actions demonstrate a complete disregard for your marital and legal obligations. You are fortunate that criminal charges weren't pursued." His once smug expression was now pure defeat. He had risked everything, believing he would win. Instead, he had lost his home, his money, and his wife. I walked out of the courtroom with my head high, divorce decree in hand, knowing I had taken back what was rightfully mine. Not just possessions or money, but my dignity and my future. With no money and nowhere to go, Mark's life continued its downward spiral. I heard about it in pieces, from mutual friends, from social media posts, from the occasional run-in with people who knew us both. He bounced between friends' couches, staying until their patience wore thin. A week here, 3 days there. Never longer than a month in one place. He showed up at Mike and Karen's with just a duffel bag, our friend Tina told me over lunch. They let him crash in their guest room for 2 weeks, but then he started asking for loans, missing curfews, bringing random women back. They had to ask him to leave. He had burned too many bridges. The charm that had once opened doors for him now seemed hollow against the backdrop of his public downfall. People who'd happily accepted his generosity when he was flush with cash now wanted nothing to do with him. He tried to get his old job back at the marketing firm, but they'd already filled his position. Other companies in our industry had heard rumors about what happened. No one wanted to hire a man who had committed fraud, even if it had been in his personal life. One rainy evening in November, 6 months after I'd found that eviction notice, I was driving home from the grocery store when I saw him. Mark was standing outside our former home, my home now, looking lost and broken. Soaked to the skin, his hair plastered to his forehead, staring at the windows where warm light spilled out. I didn't stop, didn't roll down my window, just drove past slowly, watching him in my rearview mirror until he faded from sight. The high, mighty man who thought he could outsmart me, who believed himself untouchable, now had nothing. His friends had abandoned him. His career was in shambles, his reputation destroyed. He'd gone from living in luxury hotels to nearly homeless in half a year. I felt no sympathy, not anymore. He had made his choices, calculated risks based on the assumption that I would be too weak, too emotional, too afraid to fight back. And now, He was paying for that miscalculation. That night, I blocked his profile on every social platform. I didn't need to watch his fall anymore. I had my own life to focus on. The chapter of my life that included Mark Wilson was officially closed. With Mark out of my life, I focused on rebuilding. The house that had once been our home held too many memories, too much bitterness. I sold it, legally, transparently, and used the proceeds to buy a small condo closer to downtown. 2 bedrooms, a balcony overlooking a park, and most importantly, only my name on the deed. The first night in my new place, I sat on the floor surrounded by boxes, drinking champagne, straight from the bottle, and cried, not from sadness or loss, but from relief. For the first time in almost a year, I felt like I could breathe again. The space was mine. The decisions were mine. The future was mine. To new beginnings, I toasted to the empty room and meant it. I threw myself into transforming the condo, painting walls and assembling furniture myself. Each completed project felt like reclaiming another piece of my identity. I chose colors Mark would have hated, deep blues and forest greens instead of the neutral tones he'd always insisted on. I hung art that spoke to me rather than matched. The furniture. Small rebellions that helped me remember who I was before him. At work, I accepted a promotion I'd been hesitant about while married. The new role meant more responsibility, but also more creative control and better pay. My boss had offered it 3 times before, and each time Mark had convinced me it wasn't the right move. Too much stress, he'd said. Too much time away from home. Now I understood those arguments for what they were, attempts to keep me dependent, to limit my growth. Weekends that once revolved around Mark's preferences became adventures of my own choosing. I took a pottery class, joined a hiking group, reconnected with friends who had drifted away during my marriage, friends Mark had subtly discouraged. The legal battle had been exhausting, draining both financially and emotionally. But as I settled into my new life, I realized it had been worth every sleepless night, every difficult decision. I was no longer weighed down by betrayal or uncertainty. "You seem different," my sister commented during her first visit to the condo. Lighter somehow. I smiled, knowing she was right. "I am different," I told her. "I'm me again." And I was. Stronger than before, more cautious, perhaps, but also more confident. I had faced the worst and survived. I had fought back and won. Whatever came next, I would face it on my terms. A month after settling into my new condo, I heard from Tina, one of the few mutual friends Mark, and I still shared. She called on a Sunday afternoon as I was arranging plants on my balcony, creating the small urban garden I'd always wanted. "Have you heard about Mark?" she asked, her voice a mixture of discomfort and gossipy excitement. Balanced my phone between my ear and shoulder, continuing to work. "No, and I'd prefer to keep it that way." I know, she said quickly, "but I thought you should know. He got evicted from his brother's place last week. Apparently they had a huge fight about money. His brother caught him trying to sell some family heirlooms." I set down the small trowel I'd been using, a strange feeling washing over me. Not satisfaction exactly, but something like closure. "Where is he staying now?" "That's just it," Tina said. "No one knows. He's been calling around asking for places to crash, but everyone's turned him down. Even his parents won't take him in after what happened with his brother." She paused. "He's officially homeless, Sarah. Living in his car, from what I hear." After we hung up, I stood on my balcony looking out at the city, thinking about karma and consequences. The man who had nearly made me homeless, who had tried to steal my future, had destroyed his own instead. The poetic justice wasn't lost on me. That evening, I deleted the last of the photos from our marriage from my phone. 8 years reduced to digital trash with a few taps. It felt right, necessary. The final page of a chapter I had no desire to revisit. Later that week, as I was leaving my office building, I thought I glimpsed him across the street. Thinner, shabbier, but unmistakably Mark. He was holding a paper cup, asking passers-by for change. Our eyes met for just a moment before he looked away, recognition and shame crossing his face. I didn't stop, didn't cross the street, just continued to my car, my heart steady. I had fought back and I had won. Not just the legal battle, but something more important. My freedom, my self-respect, my ability to trust my own judgment again. Mark's fall wasn't my victory. My rise from the ashes of his betrayal was. That night, I slept better than I had in a year, knowing that the worst was behind me. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace with where I was and who I had become. Whatever happened to Mark now was no longer my concern. His story had ended for me. Mine was just beginning.